With the two girls vying for his attention, George is truly quite the Chad. Allow me to point out how much better our society would be if more people aspired to be like George Bailey rather than Andrew Tate. George Bailey is the true Chad we should all aspire to emulate. It's a Wonderful Life is a 1946 movie starring Jimmy Stewart, written by Francis Goodrich, Albert Hackett, Joe Swirling, Michael Wilson, and Frank Capra, based on a story by Philip Van Doren and directed by Capra. Cards on the Table. This is my all time favorite Christmas movie, and it works out since this movie is super relevant today. In the United States, we've had a red wave in our last election. Granted, they were not landslide victories, but Republicans will have control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency early next year. And since a lot of right wing propaganda seems to focus on the idea of returning to an earlier time in the US's history, this movie is primed to be talked about. Let's look at George Bailey. He has the house, the white picketish fence, the 2.5 kids, as well as a loving, beautiful, and supportive wife at home. George Bailey is living the current conservative male fantasy. He is the true trad hero. But that's not what we see in this movie. Sure, George is able to achieve the current trad dream, but he still deals with the outright problems with society, mainly capitalism. Capitalism literally is the main villain of this movie trying to destroy George's life. I'm sure many of you are thinking, yeah, I've seen this movie. Please understand and bear with me, as current online conversations have destroyed media literacy. It is sometimes important to spell out the obvious. Even if you get the main themes of this movie, you might still learn something more about how deep these themes go. So please drop a like on this video and let me know your favorite Christmas movie in the comments as we go over how It's a Wonderful Life destroys capitalism. The movie begins with an opening credit sequence, which I just want to shout out since, considering the time period, this was definitely pages that were painted for the camera to hover over as the pages flip by. And honestly, it looks awesome. Great job, crew from 1946. We see the people of Bedford Falls praying for a man named George Bailey. We then pan up to space, where we see some glowing galaxies talking to a glowing dot. The dot is Clarence, who is a low ranking angel without wings. He is learning his mission is to help George Bailey, who is planning to commit suicide that night. If he saves George, he will get the wings he so desires. And thus launches the narrative device that will drive most of the movie as the two galaxies explain George's life to Clarence. We begin briefly in his youth. We see a sledding accident that almost took his brother, Harry's, life. This incident caused George to lose hearing in one of his ears. On the way to work, young George crosses paths with Mr. Potter, who we're told is the meanest man in town. We see George working at a pharmacy, where we see two girls George's age flirting with him. He tells one of the girls, Mary Hatch, he has big plans to explore the world. With the two girls vying for his attention, George is truly quite the Chad. Allow me to point out how much better our society would be if more people aspired to be like George Bailey rather than Andrew Tate. George Bailey is the true Chad we should all aspire to emulate. Anyways, George fails to deliver a prescription given to him by the pharmacist, Mr. Gower. Gower proceeds to assault George as George tries to convince Gower that he messed up the prescription and had accidentally placed poison in it. See, earlier, Gower learned that his son had died. In his state, he was drinking on the job and clearly at the point where he had messed up several times. George promises to keep silent on Gower's actions that day. In the middle of this, George walks into a conversation between his father, Peter, and Mr. Potter. Peter owns the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan, which is a financial institution that directly competes with Mr. Potter, and also one of the very few businesses left in town that is not controlled by Potter. Peter owes Potter $5,000, which he cannot pay immediately, Potter calls Peter an idiot for not simply foreclosing on a few houses to get the money. This causes young George to get defensive. And this brief scene represents the big driving force of the movie. So, yes, Potter is the big bad evil villain and certainly quite mean. But he represents something key to the story, and that is unrestrained capitalism. Potter has no children, no family. He cares only for the next dollar he gets. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Potter is played by Lionel Barrymore, who is Drew Barrymore's great uncle. On the other side, we have the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan, which is run briefly by Peter in the beginning and by George throughout most of the runtime. This represents the ethical capitalist, the person who runs a successful business that does good work. Unfortunately, since he actually cares about doing good, the system is designed to keep him limited in his growth. This battle, the ethical capitalist versus the unrestrained capitalist, will be the major point of conflict throughout the movie. Cut to the future, where we get the introduction of James Stewart in this movie, who will play George for the remainder. We see him buying a suitcase for his planned trip around the world. He is shocked to learn that Gower already bought him the suitcase he was looking at. It's not super relevant, but we do get a brief moment where George and his two friends, a cabbie named Ernie and a cop named Bert, check out Vi as she crosses the street. Vi was one of the girls who was smitten with George at the pharmacy. But also, I find it funny that the names the cop and the cabbie were borrowed to make the most famous gay couple in Muppet history.
Producers of Sesame Street have responded to the controversy over the recent New Yorker cover that showed Bert and Ernie as a gay couple celebrating the repeal of DOMA. Sesame Workshop released a statement today saying, quote, "We have never viewed Bert and Ernie as a gay couple, but as two friends who will do absolutely anything to get their rocks off. These pansexual perverts cannot be categorized in your narrow gay, straight, or bisexual paradigm. They're into some pretty sick shit."
Anyways, we see late that night that George has been working at the building and loan and plans to pause that and go to college and have his younger brother take over. Then, after 4 years, Harry will go to college when George is done. Peter would like George to take over the building and loan on a more permanent basis, but George isn't interested in that at all. George goes to Harry's class reunion where he's reunited with Mary Hatch. The two have romance that serves as the heart of this movie. During their romance, they go to the old Granville place that Mary would like to live in one day. Their date is interrupted by Uncle Billy, who reveals that George's father has had a stroke. We fade into the building and loan, where it's revealed that George gave up his trip to explore the world to sell the business matter of the building and loan now that his father, Peter, has passed away. In the meeting is Mr. Potter, who was given a seat on the board by Peter to try to make him happy. We see how well that is going for Potter, instantly proposing the building and loan be shut down, undoubtedly to be folded into Potter's already vast network of town ownership. George stands against this and gives a rousing speech that impresses the board with the importance of the building and loan.
Well, is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms and a bath? My father didn't think so. People were human beings to him, but to you, a warped, frustrated old man, they're cattle.
The board outvotes Potter, with the stipulation that George stay on and run the building and loan. With this, George must choose between his dream and being the one person who can stand between Bedford Falls and Mr. Potter's complete control of it. So he stays, and Harry goes to college under the new agreement that when Harry got back, George would get his chance to go to college. 4 years pass, and Harry comes back from college with a new bride, and with her comes a job opportunity for Harry that George can't let him pass on. So Harry moves on while George finds himself stuck in Bedford Falls. George's mom convinces him to go visit Mary, and drunken assholery occurs that results in Mary and George getting married. Mary and George are ready to go off on their honeymoon when they notice a ton of people trying to get into the building and loan. It's the beginning of the Great Depression. The stock market crash has left them all desperate to get their money out before they lose it. They aren't the only ones, as the bank's loans were called in. Billy gave them every cent to pay off as much as he could, which still wasn't as much as they owed. Which means the people are outside demanding money that is no longer there. George then gets a call from Potter. It's very noteworthy that during this crash, when everybody's money is in chaos, Potter is simply chilling at his place. He has enough money that he has no fear. He is also buying up the banks in town. He will cover the money of every one of the building and loan customers for 50 cents on the dollar. George has to come up with a solution or have Potter wipe the building and loan off the map. Mary's solution: use their honeymoon money to give the bank customers the bare minimum of what they need to get by until Monday. That night, we see Mary got the old Granville place she wanted, and George and her spend their honeymoon there. We cut to the future where George has set up a neighborhood called Bailey Park. Here, he builds homes for the residents, many of whom used to live in Pottersfield. We see Potter at a meeting to discuss this, where Potter notes that Bailey's have never made a dime from their business. We also learn here that the homes George makes people cost more than he charges for them. Potter invites George to a meeting to deal with the threat that Bailey Park is to his homes. Potter offers George a job making $20,000 a year. I plugged that into a conversion calculator to find out what the 2024 equivalent of that would be. Potter is offering George the equivalent of nowadays $500,000 a year. George is excited to make that much money, but considering the source and the likelihood that this would mean the end of building and loan, George asks for a day to think it over. Potter agrees, and the two shake on it. When they shake, a dark cloud forms over George, and he realizes he can't make a deal with Potter. Potter's ways have been a constant detriment to the entire town, and the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan is the only way people have to live free of Potter's hyper-capitalist ways. So George tells Potter the 1946 version of "Go fuck yourself," and leaves. We get a brief montage of the war where we see lots of characters poorly superimposed on stock footage. I mean, I mean, going to action to fight Nazis, yay! George had to stay home due to his hearing loss. We find out Harry became a war hero, saving a whole bunch of lives. They are planning a massive celebration for Harry. It's Christmas Eve, and the bank examiner comes in to look over the financials of the building and loan before he goes to see his family for the holiday. We then cut to Uncle Billy. I haven't talked about him much, but he is Peter's forgetful brother. He and Peter founded the building and loan. Anyways, Billy is at the bank to make a deposit. Potter comes in, and Billy decides to go about how Harry is a big-time war hero. Then back to business. He goes to make an $8,000 deposit for the building and loan, only to discover the money has gone missing. Turns out in his gloating, Billy accidentally left the money with Potter. George and Billy go on a search for the money. Without it, the building and loan is likely to collapse with the threat of prison time. George goes home, and we see the stress the situation is really getting to him. In his desperation, he goes to Mr. Potter to beg for a loan. Potter decides to help George by calling the police and reporting him for misappropriation of funds. It is in this meeting that we learn of George's life insurance policy. After being an ass to his whole family, he goes to get an unhealthy amount of beers. He drives home drunk and wrecks his car. He then decides to take advantage of his life insurance and end his life when Clarence interrupts. George wishes he had never been born, and Clarence shows him Bedford Falls without George Bailey. The town is now Pottersville. It is run down and filled with brothels and bars. Mr. Gower is seen as a town joke after he accidentally poisoned some of his customers. Harry Bailey has been dead since his childhood accident. Everyone on the transport he saved during the war are now also dead. But that isn't even the worst of it. See Mary. She suffered a fate worse than death or torture. She became an old maid. After George has had enough of this alternate reality, Clarence undoes the spell, and George is returned to his world, where he is met with friends, giving him the little bit of money they have to help him out. It is more than enough to save the building and loan. I love this movie, but it's certainly dated a bit. First off, there's only one black character in this movie, Annie. I haven't brought her up yet because she's not relevant to the plot. Calling her a token would be charitable. Also, the role of woman here is questionable. Mary does the best as she's seen as a confident, well rounded character, but her storyline of fixing the home has minimal impact on the story. But let's put all that aside. This movie was made after all. After 78 years, the main obstacle George has to contend with is the same obstacle we have to contend with today in this day and age. And it's not illegal immigrants or trans people or gay people or black people or women or any of the variety of other scapegoats that are out there. No, it's capitalism. Now, George represents the good and responsible capitalist. Now, this type of person does exist in real life, but you don't hear about them that much. They're not the capitalist that makes a lot of money. There's no billionaires that fall under this. But what you do hear about are the Mr. Potters of the world, people who care only for making money and will let everything else burn. It was true in 1946, and it's even more true now. Capitalism is a system designed to help and reward the most immoral among us. Things like morality and ethics hold you back in the capitalist world. Keep in mind, the moral of this movie is that family and friends are the real value in life, not money. But also keep in mind, in the narrative of this movie, Potter never suffers any consequences for his actions. Why? Because in a capitalist country, what he does is seen as reasonable. Actually, that's not quite right. In our country, what he does is actually applauded, as our country rewards making money. And that means any means you use to make that money is seen as justified. Anything you do in pursuit of the goal of making money is regarded as worth it. There are no ethical billionaires. You cannot make that much money and not harm at least someone. This movie recognized the evils of capitalism. Keep in mind, Potter is the villain, George is the hero. The movie is about how there's more to life than money. Money cannot buy happiness, although it certainly helps. In this life, we can either be moral and ethical person, or we can be a cold-blooded capitalist. We can care about our family, or we can care about money. See, while getting fun stuff is awesome, it's not the point of the holiday. The point is to be with the people you love. Sure, this movie could definitely be more diverse, as the major players are pretty much all white men. But what's striking is that the problems seen in this society are the exact same problems we deal with right now in today's society. That's why this movie has dated so well, which is actually kind of unfortunate. George cares about other people, and Potter uses that to abuse him. No good deed goes unpunished is pretty much George's motto in this movie. Doing the right thing is its own reward. It has to be, because no one ever made a dollar by doing the right thing or the ethical thing. In fact, this movie makes a good case for ethics and morals being antithetical to being the good capitalist that we're all supposed to be in this country. The ethical, moral person was being fucked by the wealthy in 1946 and continues to be fucked by the wealthy to this day. However, let's have some fun and point out one more element to this movie. See, capitalism is destroying George Bailey, but his community comes together and gives their property to him to save him. One could call this communal property, meaning the lesson of this movie is that capitalism destroys us, and only communism will save us.
Dirty word! He said a dirty word!
Books, records, films, these things matter. Call me shallow. It's the fucking truth.
So let me just leave you at this and say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays, whatever your holiday is. I hope you have a wonderful day. Though I do kind of hope for a sequel where we get our revenge on Mr. Potter.
You made one mistake, Mr. Potter. You double-crossed me and you left me alive.
Now wait just a second. I'll give you the money back.
I don't want the money. I want a piece of you, Potter.